Hello, everyone. Week 6. My name is Michael Stedman. This week is on an informative brief, so my informative brief that I decided to do was worst jobs in history. So, without further ado, I'll go into the first slide here. Alright, so my reference for this one was from jobsite.co.uk. It was an article written by Mervyn Dinnan and Career Development Workplace Issues. The first one I have up here is a chimney sweep. And this was practiced back in the late 1870s in the UK. Children would actually climb into chimneys and clean out the ash and dust. Often it was boys, sometimes girls. Usually they would start at the age of 6. And they would start from the bottom and they would actually scrape ash and scoot from the chimney's interior walls. Now, since they would start from the bottom, they would actually scrape upward, and debris that they would scrape would come down and to the ground, and you can imagine some of the dangers in that by itself. Some kids might lose their footing inside the chimney and end up slipping, sometimes getting injured, or depending on how high the chimney is, they would sometimes fall to their deaths. Of course, it being a chimney, it might be hot in there. They might get severely burned. And, of course, with the arsenic, some of the chemicals, some children actually developed cancer. This was a very dangerous job for these kids, and it was a real shame that they actually sent children up chimneys to clean them. Luckily, they don't do this anymore, of course. And I think it was 1875, a Chimney Sweepers Act in the UK was actually developed. So they put a stop to this. I think it lasted for about a good 7-10 years. So it was quickly abolished with, luckily, it wasn't a very good idea. Okay, so the next one I have is, bear with me, I'm sorry. Okay, the next one is a leech collector. This is the same reference, jobsite.co.uk. Leech collectors, gatherers, or finders. These leech collectors were used predominantly in the late 19th century in Europe. So basically, doctors, medical personnel would require leeches, and they would try to, it was very difficult for them to obtain them. So they would use leech collectors. So leech collectors, one of the methods that they used was using animals. One of the most preferred, most expeditious method was using their own legs. So you can imagine the danger in that by itself. Using your own legs to attract leeches, and with that, a lot of these leech collectors actually lost large amounts of blood, or they would get infectious diseases that were spread by the leeches. And these leech collectors did not get paid very much at all. Leeches were actually used in therapy to withdraw small amounts of blood. Later on in the medical world, they started to question it, and they basically did away with leech collecting altogether. Alright, so the next one I have here is Egyptian mummifier. And this one's from historyextra.com by Emma Mason. And so we've all heard of, mummies. We've all heard of the Egyptian history. This was around 3150 BC to 31 BC. Basically, Egyptian priests would prepare the dead for the afterlife. And these Egyptian priests got to spend a lot of time around dead bodies. They also were tasked with pulling the organs out of the dead. And one of the methods that they used to remove the brain was sticking a hook up the body's nose and pulling the brain out that way. It was a long process. On average, it would take up to 7 weeks to purify the body. So it was, they spent a lot of time around the dead. Once again, another very good job in American history. So let's see, what's the next one I got here? I have, oh, sorry about that. Alright, Whipping Boy. Also from HistoryExtra.com by Emma Mason. This one's kind of funny. So this is basically the prince would have a friend that they were brought up with, and the prince, being basically the same honor as the king, being the distinguished person that they are, they would not take beatings. You know, they could not be harmed in any way because of their birthright, per se. So, the prince, or sometimes the young king, would have his friend punished on his behalf. And this was during the 17th century in Europe. And this is where the history of the whipping boy, a term you commonly hear every now and then, actually came from. Pretty interesting stuff. This is my last one. This one I found on hankeringforhistory.com, and this article is written by Grant Oster. And this job, probably by far the worst one, also the most honorable one, the groom of the stool. Who usually got placed in this position was decided by the royal master himself. What was the job? The groom of the stool ensured there were proper facilities for the monarch's defecation and was the king's trusted advisor. And this was in the 17th century in Europe. Now, whenever the king would select somebody for this, they would select somebody with high, that they could trust, with high regard with their personal, some of the things that they would talk about behind doors. They would be privy to a lot of higher information, and so that the groom of the stool would actually be a big figurehead in the castle or in the king's hierarchy. But with that, they did actually have to, I'm not going to go into great detail, but they did have to wipe the butt of the king. So this is, I think, by far maybe one of the worst ones. It's also, interestingly enough, it was one of the most, it was a good position to be in as well, because they were privy to a lot of the king's information and some of his policies. Yeah. So that's all I have, and thank you. I hope this was very informative.